Hello, everyone. So, we're going to be talking about the origins, which means beginning of the Cold War. And the Cold War lasted from the end of World War II until the collapse of communism in the Soviet Union in 1991. This war was fought through demonstrations of strength and power between the United States and the Soviet Union. This was not a military conflict, which means there was no fighting between the Soviet Union and the United States. So these countries were just trying to show how much power they had, but there was actually no fighting. That's why it's called the Cold War. And it's between the Soviet Union and the United States. So the United States and the Soviet Union represented starkly different fundamental values. And some of the examples include the United States represented democratic political institutions and a free market economic system. So we're democratic, we have elections, people vote, we have religion, and we also have a free market, which means people can buy whatever they want, people can sell whatever they want. However, the Soviet Union was a totalitarian, which means the government controls everything. There was no elections, there's no religion, and they had a communist economic system. And that's where the government controls everything. Everybody gets the same amount of stuff. And the government tells you what you can buy, what you can have. So they're very different, the Soviet Union and the United States. President Harry Truman created the Truman Doctrine, and the Truman Doctrine of containment of communism was a guiding principle of American foreign policy throughout the Cold War. It encouraged the U.S. not to uproot, defeat communism where it already existed, but to keep it from spreading and to resist communist aggression in other countries. So Truman said, we're not going to attack communist countries, but if communism spreads, if it gets bigger, we're going to prevent it from getting bigger. And that's the Truman Doctrine. Communism in China. The communist takeover in China shortly after World War II increased American fears of communist domination of most of the world. So after World War II, China had a civil war, and the communists, which was one of the groups in the civil war, ended up winning, and they took control, and China became a communist country. It wasn't invaded from the outside. These were Chinese people that wanted it to become communist, and it became communist. And China and the Soviet Union, both communist nations, did not become allies. They weren't friends. They became rivals. So they were actually against each other, even though they were both communists. And they were rivals for territory and diplomatic influence. And this was exploited by Richard Nixon in the 1970s. So Richard Nixon, the U.S. president in the 1970s, was able to get the Soviet Union and China to kind of go against each other. And this just shows you where the People's Republic of China is. And there's something called the arms race. I don't know if you guys remember from government when you learned about the Bill of Rights, the Second Amendment, the right to bear arms. Arms means weapons. So there's essentially a weapon race. And the arms race was a race between the United States and the Soviet Union to have the most nuclear weapons. So nuclear weapons are atomic bombs, which are what ended World War II when the United States dropped atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki in Japan. And the Soviet Union matched the U.S. in nuclear weaponry in the 1950s. This made the threat of a nuclear war that would destroy both countries realistic and ever present throughout the Cold War. And America, under President Eisenhower, adopted the policy of massive retaliation. You attack me, I attack you, to deter any nuclear strikes by the Soviets. So a lot of Americans were afraid because the Soviet Union had lots of nuclear weapons. They were afraid they would drop an atomic bomb. Luckily, they never did. We never dropped atomic bombs on the Soviet Union, and part of it had to do with Eisenhower and his massive retaliation policy. Kind of the Soviet Union and the United States, they never dropped atomic bombs on each other because they knew the other person could just drop more atomic bombs back. It could have been bad, could have destroyed both countries. Luckily, neither country dropped atomic bombs on each other's. And this shows you the atomic weapons that countries had. And you can see the United States started off with nuclear weapons, but then the Soviet Union, they start building them as well, and they actually had more for a little while. And as you can see today, both countries have reduced a lot of their nuclear weapons. Now we're going to talk about the Korean War. And following World War II, Korea was split into North and South in 1948. Both claimed legitimate governments over all of Korea, and this conflict turned to war in 1950. So when Korea was split, there was a North and a South, but both of them said they controlled all of Korea, and they ended up fighting each other. The United States and the United Nations supported South Korea, while the Soviet Union and China supported North Korea. And China also fought in the war with North Korea. United States involvement in the Korean War in the early 1950s reflected the American policy of containment. So we wanted to stop the spread of communism. Early in the war, it appeared the South would lose due to Northern invasion, but the South battled back, and the war eventually turned into a stalemate, which means it was tie. So if you look, North Korea was communist, South Korea was democratic. The policy of containment, the Truman Doctrine, says we're not going to attack communist countries, but we're going to stop the spread of it. And North Korea invaded South Korea, so communism was spreading. So the U.S. came in and we helped fight, and we kicked the North Koreans back to North Korea. And toward the end of the conflict, most of the fighting took place along the 38th parallel that separated North and South Korea. The fighting ended in 1953 with an armistice, which is an agreement to stop fighting. Today, north of the 38th parallel is North Korea. South of the 38th parallel is South Korea. As a result, the Korean Demilitarized Zone was created to permanently separate the two nations, which still exists today. And today, the U.S. military maintains a presence in South Korea. Nobody won the war as North Korea remained communist and South Korea remained democratic. And that's why today there's a North Korea and there's a South Korea. And there's a line that separates it. And it's still the same way today. North Korea is a communist country. South Korea is democratic. And the 38th parallel is what separates both countries. If you guys have any questions, let me know. That's it for today.